People like you cleaned houses on this street, Mother. You were never meant to own one, my daughter said, sliding the eviction notice beside my plate like a Mother's Day card. The brunch table went still, forks down. The mimosa Renata had poured for show stopped halfway to her lips. I looked at the paper. Certified. A green sticker on the corner, the kind I'd stamped 10,000 times in my working life. A vacancy date typed in bold, the way people type things when they want them to feel already true. Renata, I said. Just her name. Low, hands folded in my lap, the way I'd learned to keep them. Don't make it a scene. She smoothed the tablecloth like the conversation was a wrinkle. The Nelson Street house is going to be sold. You'll be comfortable. There are nice places now for people your age. You should be thanking me. Her husband, Grant Halloran, did not look up from his phone. He had the decency to at least look uncomfortable about a thing he refused to stop doing. And my granddaughter, Brooke, 11 years old in her good Easter dress 2 months late, went quiet. She'd been telling me about her piano recital, the one I hadn't been invited to. She set down her juice and watched her mother's mouth and said nothing, because children learn fast which silences keep them safe. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Before that Sunday was over, the locks on Nelson Street would change, and Renata's name would not be on the new keys. I just had to open a tin I'd been forbidden to touch. Let me take you back. I am Pauline Ziegler. I am 68 years old, and I have lived in the white two-story on Nelson Street in Marion, Indiana, for all but 4 years of my life, 3 blocks from Matter Park, on the Francis Slocum side of town, where the river fog comes up off the Mississauga low and slow in May and sits in the yards like something kneeling. You learn the sounds of a house you've kept that long, the third stair that talks, the screen door that needs a hip, not a hand, the furnace clearing its throat at 4 in the morning like an old man. Every Sunday I leave the porch light on. Has nothing to do with me being home. The church van comes by at 8:15 to pick up the ones who can't drive anymore, and the driver, a young man named Dale, told me once that on a foggy morning my porch light is how he finds the curb, so it stays on. A small thing. You keep the small things, and the big ones tend to keep themselves. That's what I believed for most of my life. I want to tell you about my father, because you can't understand the house without understanding the man who couldn't have it. His name was Pauline Ziegler. Everybody called him Soul. He worked 31 years at the glass plant on the East End, came home smelling of heat and silica, and on a Saturday in the spring of 1971, he put on his only suit and walked into the bank on Washington Street to ask about a mortgage on a lot on Nelson Street. This exact lot, the empty one with the good maple. I was 13. I went with him because he wanted me to see how it was done, how a working man asks for his piece of the world. The man behind the desk had soft hands and a fountain pen he kept capping and uncapping. He looked at my father's pay stubs, which were good. He looked at my father's savings book, which was better than you'd think. And then he set it all down and said the lot wasn't right for our kind of family, and that there were other parts of Marion where we'd be more comfortable. My father didn't raise his voice. I have spent 55 years remembering that he didn't raise his voice. He thanked the man, thanked him, picked up his savings book, took my hand and walked us out onto Washington Street into the spring light. And the only thing he ever said about it was, on the walk home, Pauline, you learn to read the back of a thing. The front is what they want you to see. I didn't know what he meant. I thought he was talking about the bank papers. I thought he was just a tired man saying tired things. I was wrong about that for 40 years, because the front of my father was a man who got told no and swallowed it. That's the part I watched. That's the part I carried, like a stone in the shoe, my whole life. The terror that someday somebody would look at me across a desk and tell me in those soft, careful words that I didn't belong somewhere I'd already earned. I built a life around never being told that again. I think that's why I never made a scene, why my hands learned to fold themselves. And the back of my father, the part I couldn't read, I'll get to. I promise you I'll get to it. We did end up in this house. I never thought too hard about how. I was a girl. Grown-ups make houses appear the way they make Christmas appear, and you don't audit it. There was talk, the kind that floats over a child's head, about a man named Slocum and a trust in a different bank. I remember mail coming for years to a post office box downtown, plain envelopes with Slocum Trust stamped in the corner in faded purple ink, and my father taking them into the back room and shutting the door soft. I asked him once what it was. He said, "That's the back of the thing, baby. You'll read it when you need to." And he put it away. He died in 1989. Heart in his sleep in the front bedroom, with the window cracked because he liked the river smell. He left me the house. He left me a dented Calumet baking powder tin on the mantel that he called, with a straight face, the burial money. And he left me one instruction, repeated so many times across so many years that it had worn smooth like a river stone. "Don't you open that tin," he'd say, "until the day you're losing this house. Not a day before. You hear me, Pauline? The day you're losing it. Then you open it." I thought it was an old man's joke about funeral expenses. I thought it was grief he'd dressed up as practicality. For 37 years, that tin sat on my mantel between a photograph of my mother and a ceramic Robin Brooke made me in the 2nd grade, and I dusted around it every Saturday, and I never once lifted the lid. You make a promise to a man who loved you and you keep it past all reason. That's not foolishness, that's just how some of us are built. Now, I want to be fair to my daughter, because the truth is fairer to me than any anger would be. Renata was always reaching. Even as a girl, she'd look at the bigger houses up on the hill the way some children look at the moon, like it was a thing being withheld from her on purpose. I worked 30 years at the county recorder's office. I filed and certified the deeds of half this town. I knew where the lines on every parcel in Grant County ran, which seals were real and which were drawn by a hand in a hurry, the exact weight of a certification stamp coming down on a page. It was good work, honest, quiet, exact. It paid for Renata's braces and her band trips and the better part of a degree. She called it your little paper stamping job. Said it once at her own wedding, laughing to a circle of Halloran cousins. And I stood there in the dress I'd sewn the hem on myself and smiled because that's what a mother does. She married Grant Halloran in 2009. The Hallorans are old Marion money, or they were. The kind of name that's on a wing of the hospital and a plaque at the country club. Renata took the name with a hyphen and then, over time, started leaving the Ziegler part off when she introduced herself. I noticed. You always notice. You just don't always say. The visits got shorter. The phone calls came on schedules, the way you call an obligation. And then this spring they stopped pretending altogether, and I should have seen the eviction coming the way you see weather. But you don't expect your own child to be the storm. So there I was, Mother's Day, in the dining room of the house on Nelson Street, with a strata I'd made from scratch going cold on the sideboard and a certified notice sitting next to my water glass. I picked it up. I read it the way I read everything. The back first, the seal, the filing stamp, the recording number in the corner. Habit. 30 years of habit doesn't quit just because your heart is breaking. The vacancy date was 11 days out. 11 days. "You file this," I said, down at the county. "You actually walked it in." "I did it properly," Renata said, and there was something proud in it, God help her, through the family's attorney. "It's all in order, Mother. The house transfers to the Halloran Holding Company, and we list it before summer. The market's good right now." She said the market's good, the way other people say I love you. Whose name is on the deed, Renata? A flicker. Just a flicker. Gone fast. Ours. The family's. It's been handled. You don't need to worry yourself about the paperwork. That was never your strength. That was never your strength. I almost laughed. I had certified the transfer of more land in Grant County than any living soul. I could spot a forged notary seal across a counter by the bleed of the ink. And my daughter sat in the house her grandfather found a way to give us and told me paperwork was never my strength. I didn't say any of that. I folded the notice along the crease she'd made, and I set it down, and I looked at Brooke, who was pushing a strawberry around her plate with one finger, eyes down. "Brooke," I said, "how's the recital piece coming?" Renata answered for her. "She doesn't need the distraction right now." And Grant Halloran, who had not said one word the entire meal, chose that moment to push back his chair and say he'd pull the car around, and he walked out of my dining room studying his phone like the answer to his whole life was somewhere down inside it. I'd find out in time that it nearly was, that the Hallorans were not what their name said, that there was a river development gone bad and a payment coming due in June that they could not make, and that the only thing standing between that old proud family and the discovery that my daughter had brought nothing to the marriage but ambition was a white two-story on Nelson Street that wasn't theirs to sell. But I didn't know that yet. That Sunday, I only knew 11 days. They left before the coffee. Renata kissed the air beside my cheek and told me she'd send someone reasonable by midweek to talk about a moving timeline. Brooke hugged me hard around the middle, harder than a child hugs for nothing, and whispered, "Bye, Grandma." And then they were gone, taillights swallowed up in the fog coming off the river. I stood in my own front hall in the quiet. The church van had long since come and gone. The porch light was still on out of habit, throwing a little gold across the wet boards, and my eyes went to the mantel, to the photograph and the ceramic robin and the dented calumet tin sitting between them, exactly where it had sat for 37 years. The day you're losing the house, not a day before. I had spent a lifetime keeping that promise without understanding it. I crossed the room slow, my heart going like the furnace at 4 a.m, and I put 2 fingers on the cold metal lid of a thing my father had forbidden me to touch. For the first time, I had reason to open it. The lid gave with a small complaint, the way old metal does, and the smell that came up out of it was the smell of my father. Pipe tobacco gone to dust, and something mineral underneath, the silica that never fully washed out of any man who gave that plant 31 years. There was no money. I want you to understand that I half expected money, folded bills going soft and brown at the creases, because for 37 years I had let myself believe the kindest lie, that my father had left me something to bury him better than he'd lived. There were no bills. There was a layer of cotton wadding, yellowed, and under that, a tin floor that did not sit right. It rode a 1/4 inch too high. 30 years of feeling for the things people hide under the things they show you, and my thumbnail found the seam before my mind had finished the thought. A false bottom. My father had built me a false bottom and trusted me not to find it until the day I needed to. I worked it up with a butter knife from the kitchen drawer, my hands steadier than they had any right to be, and underneath lay 2 things. A letter, folded in thirds, the paper soft as cloth from being folded once and left alone, and a brass key, small, the kind that opens a long, flat box in a bank, threaded onto a child's shoelace gone gray with age. I lifted the key first. I don't know why. Maybe because the letter frightened me. I looped the shoelace over my head and let the key fall cold against my chest, under my collar, and there it would stay, and I would forget it was there until the moment it mattered, the way you forget the weight of a thing you have decided to carry. Then I sat down in my father's chair and I read what he wrote. "Pauline, if you have got this far down in the tin, then it has happened. The thing I spent my good years getting ready for. Somebody is trying to take the house. I do not know who. Maybe a bank, maybe a neighbor, maybe somebody I would weep to name. It does not matter who. What matters is the back of the thing, and you know how to read the back of a thing, because I taught you. They told me no on Washington Street. You were there. You saw me thank the man. I did not thank him because I was beaten, baby. I thanked him because a man who shows you his anger has shown you his whole hand, and I meant to keep mine. There is more than one bank in this world, and more than one way to put a roof in a child's name. I went to the Slocum Trust. I put this lot and then this house in your name alone, the year you turned 14, and I recorded it the right way, and I paid the trust the long, slow way, a little every month for the rest of my life. You never knew because I did not want you to grow up knowing your father had to go around the front door of the world. I wanted you to grow up thinking the front door opened for you. It does now. It always did. The proof is recorded. The proof is in the bank box this key opens. And the proof is hanging on a wall, plain as morning, in a place you would never think to look. Read the back of the thing, Pauline. I love you more than the house, but the house is how I learned to say it. Daddy. I did not cry. I want to be honest with you, because this is a story about honesty, more than it is a story about a house. I did not cry, then or after. My father gave me his calm the way other fathers give a watch or a name, and I have worn it every day of my life. And I was not going to take it off for Renata, or for grief, or for the soft, careful man behind the desk who lived on in my chest like a splinter. I folded the letter back into its thirds. I put the cotton back. I closed the tin. And I went to bed and slept, because a woman with 11 days does not waste a night. Monday morning, the fog came up off the Mississinawa the way it does in May, low and patient, and I drove downtown to the courthouse where I had given 30 years of my life, and I parked in the visitor lot because I no longer had a clerk's spot, and that small thing stung more than I expected. I will tell you why I went to the courthouse instead of straight to the bank. Because I was afraid. A lifetime of being told in those soft words that you do not belong somewhere. It does not leave you because your father wrote you a letter. Part of me, the 13-year-old part, was certain that I would pull the records and find nothing, find that I had imagined a kindness too large to be real, and I wanted a witness in the room when the floor fell out. So I went to legal aid, the little office off the second-floor hall, and I asked for help the way the frightened ask for help, hat in hand, and a young woman came to the counter. Her name was Tamika Reese. She could not have been 30. She had a lanyard and a stack of intake forms, and the particular tiredness of the young who have seen how the system grinds. I told her I had received an eviction, that my daughter said the house had been transferred, that I did not understand how a land trust worked, and I was afraid I had lost my home. Tamika Reese looked at me for a long moment, and then she set down her pen and she said the thing that woke me up. "Miss Ziegler," she said, "I know who you are. You certified my mother's deed in 2004. You trained half the people in this building. The recorder herself came up under you. Everybody on this floor learned the index off your cheat sheet, the laminated one. It's still taped inside the cabinet. So I'm going to ask you a question, with respect. Why are you standing at my counter asking me how a land trust works?" I did not have an answer, or I had the only answer, which was the splinter, the man behind the desk, the terror worn so long it felt like my own skin. But you cannot say that to a young woman with a lanyard. So I stood there, and something in me that had been folded up for 55 years began, slowly, to unfold. "You're right," I said. "I'm sorry. I forgot myself." "No, ma'am," Tamika said, and she came around the counter and she handed me a visitor's pass, the kind that gets you into the records room. "You remembered somebody else. Go be you. I'll cover the desk." So I went down the marble stairs I had climbed for 30 years into the records room with its smell of toner and old paper, and I sat down at a terminal, and my hands knew what to do before I told them. I pulled the parcel index for the Nelson Street property. I typed the number from memory. I had certified 10,000 documents in that room, and I knew, the way you know your own phone number, that the truth of a piece of land is never one document. It is a stack. It is a conversation the land has been having with the county since before you were born, and you do not read the top of it. You read all of it in order, the way my father taught me. You read the back, and there it was. 2 instruments on the file. The first was old. Recorded in the spring of 1972. A deed in trust. The Slocum Trust as trustee. The beneficiary named in language I had to read 3 times before I let myself believe it. Pauline Ziegler. Me. 14 years old in 1972, and my father had put a house under my name and never said a word, and paid it off in the dark for 17 years while my daughter grew up thinking we were the kind of people who got told no. The second instrument was new, recorded 8 weeks ago. A transfer of the Nelson Street property from the Slocum Trust to the Halloran Holding Company. The document that made Renata's eviction notice possible. The paper that turned my daughter's contempt into a vacancy date. It looked clean. It looked, to a careless eye, entirely in order. Grant's family attorney had done tidy work, but I do not have a careless eye. I have my father's eye. I pulled the image up close. I studied the notary block, the little inked seal in the corner where a notary public swears that the people who signed are who they say they are, that the signatures are real, that the law was standing in the room, the seal was clear, the name was clear. A notary named Harold Pruitt, commission number and all, the date of the acknowledgement stamped right there beside it, 8 weeks ago. Harold Pruitt. I knew that name. You work 30 years in a county and you come to know the notaries the way a churchgoer knows the deacons, by their seals, by the slant of their stamps, by the little human habits that creep into official work. Harold Pruitt had notarized documents in Grant County for as long as I had been certifying them. A careful man, a widower. He used to bring lemon drops to the recorder's counter at Christmas, and Harold Pruitt had passed away. I had been to the visitation. It was in the autumn, 2 years before the date stamped on that seal. I sat in a folding chair at the funeral home on Adams Street, and I signed the book and I shook his daughter's hand. A dead man cannot swear that a signature is real. A dead man cannot stand in a room and watch a pen move across a page. Harold Pruitt had been gone 2 years on the morning his seal supposedly came down on the document that gave my house to the Hallorans. I sat very still in that records room, with the toner smell and the hum of the old fluorescent light, and I felt the 13-year-old girl inside me go quiet at last, because she finally understood what her father had been telling her on the walk home from the bank. The front of the thing is what they want you to see. A clean deed, a tidy seal, a vacancy date in bold. The back of the thing is where the truth lives. And the back of this thing was a dead man's name on a living lie. Somebody had used Harold Pruitt's seal. Somebody had reached for a stamp belonging to a man who could no longer object, because the dead make such cooperative witnesses. The question that sat down across from me in that quiet room and folded its hands the way I fold mine was simple, and it was patient, and it would not leave. If Harold Pruitt did not notarize that transfer, who signed his name? I printed the parcel index. I printed both instruments. I printed the notary's commission record with its expiration, and I pulled from the vital records the county keeps the plain sad fact of Harold Pruitt's date of passing, and I laid them side by side on the long oak table, where I had taught a dozen young clerks how to read a chain of title. The dates did not lie. The dates never lie. People lie and seals lie when a liar holds them, but a date sits on a page and tells you the truth long after everyone in the room has agreed to forget it. And as I gathered my papers, the back of the thing began to open wider than my own front door, because a person who will use a dead notary's seal once will use it more than once. A clean, tidy attorney who will manufacture a transfer to take one old woman's house has, somewhere in his neat files, done it before and will do it again. And the thought that came to me then was not about Renata, and was not even about me. It was about who else on the quiet streets of this town had been told in soft, careful words that they were never meant to own what they had already earned. I thought of 2 houses on Nelson Street, old Mr. Abernathy's, 2 doors down, and the little gray one on the corner where a young mother named Lacey was raising a child alone, And I remembered, the way you remember a thing you were too young to understand the first time, that my father's name had once moved quietly through both of those houses too. So I gathered my papers, and I thanked Tamika Reese at the counter, and I drove home through the fog to find the next thread my father had left me to pull. The fog hadn't lifted by the time I turned onto Nelson Street, and the houses came up out of it one at a time, the way memory gives a thing back to you in pieces. Mine first, white and patient, the porch light still burning gold in the gray. Then, 2 doors down, the narrow brick where old Mr. Abernathy had lived since Eisenhower. And on the corner, the little gray house, paint peeling at the eaves, where the young mother named Lacey kept a porch swing and a tricycle, and a child's chalk drawings going soft in the damp. My father's name had moved through both of those houses. I had felt it move, as a girl, without understanding what I felt. Now I meant to understand. I did not go inside my own door. I parked, and I sat a moment with my hands folded on the wheel the way I fold them, and then I walked down to the brick house, and I knocked. Cornelius Abernathy was 91 years old that spring, and he opened the door in a cardigan buttoned wrong, and his face, when he saw me, did a thing I will not forget. It softened the way a face softens at a name it has been waiting to hear. Pauline Ziegler, he said. Soul's girl. I wondered when you'd come. I had known this man my whole life as the quiet neighbor who waved from his glider and brought zucchini in August whether you wanted it or not. I had not known he was waiting for me. He sat me down at a kitchen table with a vinyl cloth, and he poured coffee I did not want and could not refuse. And he told me a thing my father never had. 19 and 81, he said. I got behind. After Ruth passed, I got behind, and the county put my house on the list. The tax sale list. You know what that is? You work down there. They'd have sold my home out from under me on the courthouse steps for the back taxes, a quarter of what the place was worth, and some fellow from out of town would have had it for a song. He turned his coffee cup a slow quarter turn on the vinyl. Your daddy found out. I never told him. I was too proud to tell anybody. But Sol Ziegler had a way of knowing what a man was too proud to say. He didn't come to me with money in his hand because he knew I wouldn't take it. He went down to that courthouse himself, and he did some quiet paper thing. Put my house into some trust arrangement, the Slocum Trust he called it, so the county couldn't touch it while I got back on my feet. Bought me 3 years. I paid it back every dollar. Took me till 88, but he bought me the years. The old man looked at me. I've kept up that house for 40 years, just so it'd be worth keeping when somebody came asking. You're the somebody, aren't you? The Slocum Trust. The same name stamped on the envelopes I'd seen come to my father's post office box my whole childhood, the ones he'd tuck into his coat without a word. I had thought it a bill. I had thought, God forgive me, it might have been a debt, the soft shame of a man who couldn't quite manage. It was the opposite of a debt. It was a man managing the whole quiet street. Mr. Abernathy, I said, do you still have the paper? The trust paper my father did for you? Course I do, he said, almost offended. Read the back of a thing, he always told me. I keep the back of everything. And he shuffled to a sideboard and brought out a manila folder soft as flannel, and inside it was a declaration of trust, the Slocum Trust as trustee, and down in the corner where the recorder certifies that a document is true and was entered into the record on such a day was a stamp. I knew that stamp the way you know a handwriting. It was the recorder's certification, and it carried a certification number, a long string of digits the office assigns in sequence, one after another, year after year, never repeating, never out of order. I had pressed that very stamp 10,000 times with my own hand. I read the number on Cornelius Abernathy's deed, and I felt the cold key shift against my chest under my collar, and a thought arrived that was not yet a plan, but was the shape a plan grows in. If my father's trust documents all carried certification numbers in sequence, and they would, because that is how the office worked, because that is how I had taught a dozen young clerks the office worked, then the number on my own deed would sit near these. They were entered in the same season by the same careful man into the same book. The truth of a piece of land is never one document. It is a conversation, and these papers were all part of one long sentence my father had been speaking quietly into the record of this county for 30 years. I thanked the old man. He held my hand at the door with both of his, dry and light as paper themselves, and he said, "You tell whoever needs telling." Sol Ziegler didn't go around the front door of the world for nothing, and I went down his steps into the fog with my heart going steady and hard. I did not go home yet. I walked to the corner, to the little gray house, and the young mother, Lacey, opened the door with a baby on her hip and flour on her hands, and the wary look of a woman who has learned that knocks are usually bad news. I told her who I was. The wariness fell off her face all at once. "You're Saul's daughter," she said. Oh, come in. Let me get you a chair, the good one, not that one." And she was flustered in the way of someone meeting family they've only heard described. And I understood, standing in her cluttered, warm front room with the smell of something baking, that I was about to learn a third thing. "He co-signed for me," she said, once the baby was down and the kettle was on. 6 years ago. I was 22 with a baby coming and no husband, and the bank wouldn't look at me twice. My mama cleaned houses, Miss Ziegler, over on the east side, and I grew up thinking that was the ceiling. That was as high as the air went for people like us. And this old man I barely knew, your father, he heard about my trouble from the church van driver of all people, and he came and sat right where you're sitting, and he said, "A young mother ought to own her own roof." And he put his name next to mine on that little loan through the Slocum Trust so I'd qualify. He never asked for a thing. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, embarrassed. He passed before I could thank him proper. So I send the trust $1 every month. $1 in an envelope, just so somebody knows I didn't forget. I know it's silly. The bookkeeper probably throws it out. "It isn't thrown out," I said, though I had no way yet of knowing that and found I believed it anyway. "It's recorded. Everything he did was recorded. That was the whole of his genius. He understood that a thing written down and entered into the book outlives every man who'd tell you no." I sat with Lacey a while. She showed me the deed, soft in its own manila folder. The back of it kept the way Cornelius Abernathy kept his, the way my father had taught everyone he touched to keep things. And there, in the corner, the recorder's certification and the number. I copied it into the little notebook I carry. Abernathy's number, Lacey's number, and somewhere between them, threaded into that same season of careful work, would be mine. 3 houses on one foggy street, and one quiet man had put a roof over all of them, and never once said so out loud. My father had not left me burial money. He had left me a method. He had left me proof that the front door of the world had been open all along, for me and for the neighbors, because one man had refused to accept the answer no. That evening, I sat at my own kitchen table with my father's letter unfolded before me, and the brass key warm now from a day against my skin, and I read the line again. "The proof is in the bank box this key opens." I had been afraid of the bank box the way I'd been afraid of the courthouse, the old terror, the soft voice telling me I did not belong in the rooms where ownership is kept. But the terror had thinned. Tamika Reese's voice had cut into it. Cornelius Abernathy's 2 dry hands had cut into it. Lacey's $1 a month had cut into it. By the time the fog went dark outside my windows, I was not afraid anymore. I was something colder and cleaner than afraid. I was ready. The Slocum Trust Bank was downtown on the Francis Slocum side, a stone building I had walked past 1,000 times, and Tuesday morning I walked into it with the shoelace lifted over my head and the brass key in my closed hand. I told the young man at the desk that I was a beneficiary of a trust, that I had a box, that I had the key. I gave him my name. I watched him type it. I watched his face, braced out of habit for the small frown, the soft turning away, the "are you quite sure?" It did not come. He smiled and said, Yes, miss. Ziegler, the box is showing right here. It's been held a long time. Let me take you back. Let me take you back. The same words. A man can mean them as a courtesy and not know he's handing a woman the whole of her childhood across a marble counter. The box was long and flat and gray, and the key my father had hidden under a false bottom for 37 years slid into it and turned with a small, clean sound. And inside, wrapped in the same yellowed cotton wadding I'd found in the tin, were the recorded originals. The Declaration of Trust, the deed in trust from the spring of 1972, the beneficiary named in my father's own steady hand, recorded the right way, certified the right way, by a recorder long retired, Pauline Ziegler, and in the corner, the certification stamp, the number. I laid my notebook beside it on the little shelf in that quiet vault. Abernathy's number, Lacey's number, and mine, falling exactly where I knew it would, between them in the long, unbroken sequence, entered the same season, the same careful sentence spoken into the record of this county. The proof was not a story I was telling. It was a number that matched a number that matched a number, and numbers do not soften, and numbers do not turn away, and numbers do not tell a woman she was never meant to own a thing. I sat in that vault a long while with my father's papers in my lap. Then I noticed, clipped to the back of the original deed, read the back of a thing, a small note in his hand, later than the rest, the ink a different age. It said only this: the recorded original lives in 2 places, baby, here, and on the wall. I gave the trust declaration a frame so a thief would dust it and never read it. You will know the wall when you stand in front of it. You have stood in front of it before and called it ugly. A frame. A wall I had stood in front of and called ugly. I closed the box. I signed it back into the bank's keeping, and I kept the originals, and I walked out into a noon that had finally burned the fog off the river, and I knew exactly which wall my father meant. I had stood in front of it at Renata's housewarming, and at 2 Thanksgivings, and once at a baby shower, and every time I had thought, privately, that it was the homeliest thing in that grand foyer, a cheap framed sampler, and cross-stitched letters going dusty under glass. Bless this house. It had been hanging in my daughter's foyer for 6 years, and Renata had walked past it 10,000 times on her way to tell me I'd never been meant to own anything, and she had never once thought to read the back of it. I drove home to Nelson Street. The church van was making its evening round, and I waved, and the driver waved back. I went inside, and I set my father's originals on the mantel beside the photograph and the ceramic robin and the empty tin, and I let them rest there one night in the place where they began. Tomorrow was Wednesday. Renata had said she'd send someone reasonable by midweek to talk about a moving timeline. I decided I would save her the trouble. I would go to her. Wednesday came up clear for the first time in a week. The fog finally beaten back off the Mississiniua, and I dressed the way my mother dressed for church, the navy suit and the small gold earrings, and my hair set the night before, because a woman does not go to take back what is hers looking like she came to apologize. I put the recorded originals in a flat leather folder. I put the brass key back under my collar on its shoelace, where it had lived against my skin for 11 days. And I drove across town to the Halloran house on the bluff above Matter Park, the big stone one with the iron gate they leave open so the neighbors can admire it. And I parked my old sedan in the circle drive between 2 cars worth more than my house, and I walked up to the door my daughter had married into, and I rang the bell. Renata answered it herself. She had not expected me, and for one unguarded second, her face was just a child's face, my child's face, before it closed back into the smooth, careful mask she'd learned from the Hallorans. "Mother," she said, "we agreed I'd send someone. You didn't need to come all the way out here." "I know what we agreed," I said. "I came anyway. May I sit down? I'm 68 and I've been driving." She could not say no to that with her in-laws' portraits watching from the stair, so she stepped back and let me into the foyer. The grand, cold foyer with the marble floor and the chandelier and the curving staircase. and her husband, Brett, came to the top of the landing with his phone still in his hand, the way it had been at the brunch table. And somewhere upstairs I heard the small sound of my granddaughter practicing scales, the same 8 notes over and over, climbing and falling. "I'll only need a few minutes," I said, and I did not raise my voice, because calm is the one thing they have never been able to take from me. Not the bank on Washington Street in 1971, and not my daughter on Mother's Day. "Renata, you handed me a paper 11 days ago. You read me a date out loud at my own table. I'd like to answer it now the way your grandfather taught me to answer things, on paper." "Mother?" She folded her arms. "I don't want to be unkind, but you don't understand the instruments involved here. The trust, the title, the recording requirements. It's complicated property law, and you spent 30 years stamping the back of other people's documents. This is exactly what I was afraid of. You think because you sat behind that counter, you can read a chain of title." "I can," I said. "That's the part you forgot." I opened the leather folder on the little gilt table by the door, the table meant for calling cards and car keys, and I laid out the first sheet. "This is your great-grandfather's letter to me," I said. "Solomon Ziegler. He left it in the calumet tin on my mantel, the one you used to call the burial money, the one he told me to open only on the day I lost the house." I opened it. There was no burial money, Renata. There was this letter and a key and the name of a trust, the Slocum Trust. You've seen that name your whole life and never asked what it was. She had gone still. "In 1971, I said, the bank on Washington Street told my father his kind of family didn't get a mortgage on Nelson Street. I was a girl. I stood next to him while he took his hat off, and they told him no, and he put his hat back on and didn't say a word, and I spent my whole life afraid of that voice, the soft one that tells you you were never meant to own the thing you've already earned. That's the voice you used on me at brunch. I'd know it anywhere. I've been listening for it since I was 11. Brett had come halfway down the stairs. What my father did, I said, after they told him no, was he stopped going to the front door of that world. He went to the side. He bought the lot through the Slocum Trust, a land trust, perfectly legal, and he recorded the deed in trust in the spring of 1972, and he named one beneficiary on it, not himself, me, Pauline Ziegler. He put that house in my name when I was a girl, and he never told me, because he didn't want me to live the way he'd lived, waiting on permission. He provided for me out of the very thing they used to shame him. I've spent 11 days reading it back together. That's a story, Renata said, but her voice had thinned. A story isn't a recorded instrument. No, I agreed. It isn't. So let me show you the recorded instrument. I laid out the declaration of trust from the bank box, the recorded original, my father's steady hand, the recorder's certification in the corner. This came out of a safe deposit box downtown this Tuesday. Your great-grandfather kept the key for 37 years under the false bottom of a baking powder tin. You asked me once why I never threw that ugly old can away. I touched the shoelace at my collar and lifted the brass key over my head and set it on the marble table, where it made a small, bright sound. Because the box wouldn't open without this, and the box held the truth. She was looking at the certification stamp now, the way a person looks at a thing they have been telling themselves does not exist. I taught half the clerks in that courthouse how to read this stamp, I said. It carries a number. The recorder assigns them in sequence, one after another, never repeating, never out of order. I pulled the parcel index on my own house, Renata, and I found 2 instruments on the file, mine, from 1972, and the one your husband's people had drawn up, the transfer that was supposed to move my house quietly into a Halloran holding company before anyone could ask a question, and that second one references a notary's seal. I looked up at Brett. The notary who supposedly witnessed that signature died 2 years before the date on your document. I checked it against the county death index Monday afternoon. A dead man does not stamp a seal, Mr. Halloran. Somebody borrowed his? The 8 notes upstairs had stopped. You're talking about forgery, Brett said very quietly. I'm talking about a date that can't be true, I said. I'll let the county decide what to call it. They will. The eviction Renata filed against me put my parcel back in front of the recorder's office for the first time in 50 years. And when they pull that file to process a vacancy, they'll find both instruments sitting on top of each other, mine clean and theirs impossible. And they will open a review whether anyone wants them to or not. You filed the very paper that makes them look. I didn't have to do a thing but let it arrive. Renata sat down on the bottom stair. She sat down the way the air goes out of a thing. I know about the Riverside development, I said. Gentler now because she was still my child. I know it failed. I know there's a payment due in June that the Hallorans don't know you can't make because you brought nothing to this marriage but my mother's good name, and you've been terrified for 2 years that they'd find out. So you went looking for something to sell, and you looked at the only thing your family ever had that was paid for free and clear. And you decided an old woman living in the past was wasting it. You told yourself you were saving everybody. I've heard that voice too. It's the same soft voice, Renata. You just learned it from the wrong side. She didn't deny it. She put her face in her hands, and she didn't cry either, because she's mine after all, and we don't. I turned then, and I crossed the cold marble to the wall beside the coat closet where it had hung at every party I'd ever been invited to, and not quite welcomed at. The homeliest thing in that whole grand house, a cheap, cross-stitched sampler going dusty under glass. Bless this house in faded thread. I had stood in front of it at her housewarming and 2 Thanksgivings and a baby shower, and thought, privately, that it was ugly. My father told me, "You have stood in front of it and called it ugly." Read the back of a thing, Pauline, I said out loud, to nobody, to him. He told me that my whole life. I lifted it off its hook. It was heavier than a sampler should be. I turned it over in my hands, and I slid my thumbnail under the dust paper on the back. The cheap brown paper they staple over a frame, and it peeled away dry and easy, and underneath it was not cardboard. It was a sheet of heavy stock, foxed at the edges, and in the corner, bleeding faintly through where the cheap backing had pressed against it for years, was a recorder's certification I would have known blind by feel in the dark. The certified declaration of trust, the duplicate original. My father had framed it behind a homely needlework picture and hung it in plain sight, because he knew that a thief will dust a thing and never read it, and he gave it to Renata to hang on her own wall, where she walked past it 10,000 times on her way to tell me I had never been meant to own anything. He gave you the proof, I said. He let you hang it in your foyer for 6 years. You displayed it. You straightened it. You never once turned it over. Renata looked at the back of that frame, and at the stamp, and at her great-grandfather's hand, and I watched my daughter understand, all at the same moment, that the house had answered to me the entire time, and she had simply forgotten to ask the deed who it belonged to. The locks on Nelson Street are already changed, I told her, because I'd had the man come Tuesday afternoon. Your name was never on them. It was never going to be. I did not gloat. There is no profit in it, and my father didn't raise me to it. I gathered my papers back into the leather folder, and I left the framed declaration leaning against their grand wall for the county's people to photograph. And I said goodbye to my granddaughter, who had come down to the landing in her sock feet, and I told her I would very much like to come to her recital if she still wanted me. And she said, "Yes, Grandma," in a small voice. And that was the only thing I had truly wanted out of any of it. The county did open the review. It was not loud and it was not quick, the way real things never are. But the title company that had to clear the mess found that my father's parcel was not the only one a Halloran instrument had reached for. There was a pattern in it. An elderly couple out on the Francis Slocum side, a widow near the park, 3 or 4 old Marion names who had been told in soft, careful letters that the homes they had paid off across 40 years did not quite legally belong to them. The review reached every one of those files, and I sat in the legal aid office where Tamika Reese works, and I said to her, The young woman who'd shamed me awake by asking why I was asking her how a land trust worked, I said, "And what about the mothers who don't have 30 years in that recorder's office? Who reads the back of the thing for them?" So I learned how to do what my father did. It is not complicated. The side door of the world. You only have to know it's there. Before the leaves turned, I had sat at 2 more kitchen tables on Nelson Street, Cornelius Abernathy's and Lacey's, and put their homes into the Slocum Trust the right way, recorded and certified. Beneficiaries named in plain, steady hands so that no soft voice could ever come for their roofs again. The bookkeeper still gets Lacey's dollar every month. It is still recorded. Everything is. I keep the deeds in the calumet tin now on the mantle where the burial money never was, beside the photograph and the ceramic robin and my father's folded letter. 3 houses, 1 street. One quiet man's method, passed down at last to the daughter he provided for all along. The porch light is still on. The church van still rounds the corner at dusk, and I still wave, and the 2 new deeds rest in the tin where my father's key once waited. The deed answers to her now,